Hi, I'm Paul Stringfellow. Welcome to another edition of CTO Insights. And as you'll notice, got a brand new studio to kind of raise the level of professionalism that when I talk to fellow CTOs about important CTO type matters. So on this week's show, I'm joined by somebody you may have seen on our Tech Takeaways podcast. If you've never seen Tech Takeaways, you go find a link on our website. You'll be able to find it there. We've got great shows with short looks at technology topics. But this is a guest. I'm joined today by somebody who's a guest on a couple of those shows. We covered some really interesting topics, and what I wanted to do is expand that a little bit more for our CTO audience. So I'm joined today by Kirk Ryan. Hi, Kirk.
Hey, Paul. How you doing?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you, mate. Nice to see you again, and welcome back to the luxurious studios and my nice now brand new round table. So we're going to be covering probably the hottest of enterprise IT topics. I think we're going to be just discussing Gen AI. But before we jump into that, for people who've not seen you on Tech Takeaways, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and kind of what the focus is in your role now.
Sure. So right now I'm really focused on generative AI, who isn't, right, as a CTO role, but really around also the innovation around it, builder sort of tooling as well, and just really looking at practical applications of, it's a new buzzword. There's lots of great things going on, but how does this actually translate into reality in terms of the projects you can actually put it in right now, based on how mature it is? And exploring around sort of how do we protect against things that could expose our business in certain ways, like guardrails and safety and other things that we need to take into account to actually make it practical for enterprise application.
Yeah, and you bring into this kind of an interesting background as well, don't you? So you've got some different hats that you wear, but that's included, building a brand new company using kind of cloud and AI technology stacks to kind of develop it, to roles where you're working with a range of kind of CTOs trying to understand the problem. So, so I think it gives you a really interesting perspective of that. And so maybe by way of introduction, I guess I'm pretty sure nobody watching this doesn't know when we're talking about AI and Gen AI, what we're talking about. But maybe for context for this show, do you want to talk a little bit about, bring a little perspective to what you're seeing when you're looking at the field right now, maybe how it's evolving and some of the challenges that you see business owners, CTOs looking to try and address.
Yeah, and it's a great time because, the last few weeks, it's really been event season as well. So I've had a great opportunity to catch up with a lot of CTOs from some of the larger sort of enterprises all the way through to, startups who are looking for the next big thing. And really there's a lot of trends between the two in terms of AI. Where does it fit? From your traditional sort of use cases in terms of co-pilots, I think, are most famous ones. Anybody who's a developer, I think you'll struggle to find one that's not using some form of co-pilot right now to enhance their productivity. And productivity being the key word there, I think that's number one in terms of what you get out of generative AI is enhancing your productivity. Marketing teams will be no stranger to being able to generate 4, 10, 50 new images at the drop of a hat just via text. Quite dangerous for a CTO to go into marketing, so we'll try not to do that. Right? But then at the same time, you can see some of the early adopters, some of the stories starting to emerge from where they get it right. More importantly, obviously, bad news travels faster, gets amplified more where they got it wrong. So I think, we're learning from the mistakes of some of the earliest adopters and then looking at, well, how do we solve those challenges? Because let's all be quite frank about this. There isn't a playbook for a lot of this stuff. We are right at the forefront of this technology, having to make those mistakes ourselves. And then as CTOs, trying to say, okay, well, where can we afford to make those mistakes? Because obviously there are things where we can do it and we'll only expose ourselves if it's internal. But there's other places, obviously, it would be a disaster if it were to happen. And, you start taking things like, what happens if my new model that we've just launched fails 3 out of 100 times, for example? Is that acceptable to my business in terms of its reputation and brand? And more often than not, it's not.
Yeah, and often that will, I guess, depend on where you're making the 3 mistakes and kind of the things that you do as an organization as well. But there's really interesting stuff in what you just talked about there. And I think it's helpful to understand some of the context about that. So you talked about Copilot. So, lots of people are probably aware of Microsoft Copilot. Yep. Obviously, actually the phrase Copilot is be commonly adopted across things. So when we talk about Copilot, what do we mean by a Copilot? How's that different from other forms of AI?
Yeah, I mean, you think of it best as like a digital assistant in a way. So there are many different forms of Copilot. I think the one that anyone in tech is probably most familiar with is the development Microsoft Copilot, for example. Others do exist. But really, it's that case of, okay, look, realistically, go ask any developer. They used to spend a lot of their time Googling. And the best developers were the ones that were best at Googling the problem, effectively. Because you only have to spend 3 months away from the code you've written, go back and go, what was I doing? I can't remember. So having that ability to say, summarize lines 71 to 140 and just tell me what it was doing again, because I have no clue, just really enhances productivity. I think the other sort of form of Copilots we're seeing now as well is around customer service. So the ability that your customer service can learn from, you've probably had a system that's got lots of tickets in it, but how do you make that knowledge available to all of your agents? Right? Because they build up their own playbooks and they get really good at what they're doing. But if there's a new problem that they've not been exposed to, it used to be around keyword search or anything. And then you'd have to go dig in and stuff. And not necessarily the context was there or anything. So what that allows you to do is really get that information faster. Get it in a way that you can then, ask for it in a certain format, can help you in that customer experience, deliver increases in perhaps your NPS scoring. And also just the fact that you can start to make your internal knowledge bases much more powerful in a way that, that knowledge, a lot of knowledge used to go to these systems, but it would just die there. It'd never come back. So it's great to be able to draw upon that knowledge and say, hey, look, that was a problem from 3 years ago. And we didn't know that, the agent that's probably left was a specialist in this and had dealt with it 7 times before and we've seen it. And it's regression. And just by that nice way of exposing it into the Copilot, making sure this information's available, and I can talk about how you make that information available in those models, because there's 2 main ways of doing it. One's more expensive than the other, but really sort of putting that into your processes. That's where the special sort of sauce is in how you do it.
So maybe to step back a touch, because there's some really interesting stuff in what you've talked about there. And I think actually even that example of being able to look back and go, oh, here's something that we wrote 2-3 years ago and, and being able to find out useful information from that. But obviously that's a double-edged sword. Things that a Copilot can learn that might be 2 to 3 years old comes with its own challenges. But maybe just to step back a touch. So in your conversations and in your role right now, what are some of the challenges you see for people who are starting off that kind of AI adoption, whether it's a Copilot or some other type of AI? What are some of the challenges that you see in terms of that initial phase of adoption? So what are the things that people are maybe trying to solve, and then how do they look to start evaluating what kind of approach they might be able to take?
So really sort of the main challenges I think that people are trying to solve, and you could argue is the technology before the challenge right now. And so are we thinking of which areas should we apply it to? And I think it's actually that sort of model. It's the technology that's been very useful, and now we're doing it in reverse rather than, most startups and products come from a customer need.
Yeah. We're trying to find a problem to solve.
Exactly that. Yeah. And the successful ones really come from well-defined user stories. So just like any platform, the ones that succeed have very good user stories. A lot of this is exactly what it needs to deliver, how it's delivered, the specification has been made. The projects that I see that are most unsuccessful are the ones that just forget those foundations of developing good software. Where they go, okay, we've got this thing that can answer everything. Let's just cram all our knowledge in there. First problem you've got, and the very first problem of any AI ML problem is data in. You've got to sanitize that data. You've got to clean that data. You've got to make sure it's relevant. Like you say, it's like there's no good me making sure an instruction manual from our platform of 10 years ago is uploaded in there. And I didn't know it was there. And I've uploaded perhaps the latest instruction manual. And now they're conflicting. And how do I go into the model and see that? What processes, what UI, what guardrails do I have that go and do this? How does it tell me there's a collision? Because all that's happening is it's running through an embedded model. It gets stuck in a vector database. Those 2 things are similar. How do you know which one it's picking? right? It could be, your operating system version 7 or version 10. You have no idea. It's very hard. And then you've got to go, right, how do we gatekeep this? So that's the first challenge is, spend 80% of your time making sure the data you're putting in is right in terms of whole project.
Well, I think you make a really interesting point as well about, I think if we round the clock 3-4 years, 5 years maybe, and talked about challenges that we see with people adopting cloud. And one of the conversations I remember having with lots of people was how we would forget all the good practice that we'd learned building a data center and having policies and procedures in place for how we ran a data center. We'd move to the cloud and we'd just go, oh, the cloud will solve that. and we stop doing it. And suddenly you get security problems, you get costs out of control, you get inefficient process, whatever it might be. And all because we forgot all of the good stuff that going in. And it's really interesting what you just talked about there, in that the idea that the discipline that we have today as CTOs in terms of delivering projects, one of those starting points is what's the defined outcome? What's success look like for this project? But it sounds like actually when it comes to AI, and I think even from my own experience of turning on Copilot in Microsoft 365, it's a little bit of, now I've turned this thing on, what can I get it to do?
Now what?
And I talk to lots of, as you do, I talk to lots of CTOs, and actually one of the things that's interestingly and coming back in a lot of conversations is we want to explore AI, and we'll just use AI as the kind of the broad term for all kinds of things at the moment. We want to explore AI, but we don't really know why. Yeah. And what we're interested in is what's other people doing, And actually, I think it's a really interesting one. I think it's a really interesting tip is if you're going to do this, don't forget the basics of having a well-defined, like you said, a well-defined story, but what's an outcome look like? What's good look like if we're going to do this? What's success look like? And kind of start there. So, so as people have defined a story, so let's skip ahead. So people have defined, you're a CTO and you've got a good use case in your business where you think AI might be able to help. What's kind of the process that then, in your experience, what are some of the processes you've seen that start to drive the adoption of the right kind of approach and the right kind of technology and the right kind of deployment?
Yeah, I think it's become a lot easier. I'm not sure it's right, but it's become easier to adopt these technologies because there's just so many frameworks available right now. But it is a double-edged sword because you don't necessarily know how they're working under the covers. Yeah. So yes, you can get from A to B much faster, and you know that B's, you've got something to show. And that's exciting as CTO because you go from idea to there it is in front of you and you can see it, it's visualizing, it's doing stuff.
And I guess you can do that quickly as part
exactly
of
that, yeah.
I just want to pick on, so you mentioned frameworks. What do you mean by frameworks?
So, for example, we don't have to go and get a PhD in mathematics. We don't need to know about all the theories and theorems and everything else that make the maths behind this now. We can just go, here's LangChain, for example. This LangChain, I can plug in any model I want, open source or proprietary. I can plug in Claude. I can plug in Llama 3 or whatever it is. It'll probably be out of date in 3 weeks' time. But I think that's exciting that you can take these frameworks, take these models, put them all together, and these frameworks just make it very easy to consume these technologies right now. Now, that's important because the major step here is most organizations will not go and build their own foundational models, ones that understand language, understand the nuances around, I want a bit of code that does this. Can you look at my code and do that? These models are already being done. You need 40,000 GPUs to go and do it. We just don't have the money to go and do this stuff. So we're putting our trust in either proprietary players or the open source. And open source, thankfully, the likes of Meta and that are releasing these massive models they're good enough to start. But it's, as you know, it's usually the last, 5% of a project that takes up the most time because you've got to get that right. So that's where the framework makes, the let's get up and running, let's get something functional really easy. It's the latter stages where I think the focus needs to be in terms of the guardrails. How do we make sure that these models are right? I think use cases have moved away from being a single model. We're starting to see a lot more like theory of like multi-agent approaches now as well. So you could have a great large language model, LLMs, which give you that sort of awareness, and it feels like you're talking to someone. It understands how to deliver the answer in the way that makes sense to you. I think there was a lot of buzz around fine-tuning at the start. So you cut off some layers. You tell it, I want you to speak like John, a famous movie star or whoever. Speak like this, and it would, do that for you. But that seems to have gone away now because that's quite expensive, and most people do not have that level of knowledge in the team, which leaves you now with the sort of more dominant architecture, which is retrieval augmented generation, RAG. It's a terrible name. Where, okay, what happens if you can present your knowledge to the large language model? Because your company data, hopefully, especially your internal data, is not part of its foundational training base set. So it's not there as part of that corpus. So what happens is you make it available at runtime. It's got the general knowledge to go, okay, I'm now getting this information. I'm going to bring it back. But then you still have the nuances of, but what data did Meta have? If we take Llama 3, for example, on my company, and where did it get it from? Was it company's house? Was it a news article from somewhere 3 years ago? Was it a customer review? Was it somebody on Reddit? I don't know if it's going to take that data and put that back, or if it's going to bring it out and from my model, especially the largest ones, because they have a bit of an attention problem right now as well. So like myself.
What was you saying?
Yeah, where are we?
Yeah.
So I think that's where, going back to the start of bringing my attention back to the start of frameworks. It's exciting, but you really need to understand a little bit more of how they're working. They are open source. Spend the time understanding really how the logic behind it's pulling the data together.
And so when you talk about open source, how does that compare? So something like that, how does that compare to, investing in what Microsoft are doing in their ecosystem or Google are doing with Google Workspace? How does, because I think for lots of general businesses, perhaps, that's how they're going to start to see the adoption of AI. So how do those two kind of models compare? And can we talk a little bit more as well about that idea of looking at specific data sets and training models with that? How does that practically go? So I suppose there's two questions there, and they weren't necessarily related, but one about what's the difference between a Microsoft Copilot for 365 versus kind of an open source model, and then what's the route for that kind of education around specific, how do companies make sure that they're doing that right, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, the great thing here is we have some fantastic large companies, personal, if you think they're fantastic or not, that are investing large amounts of resources, time, energy, literally energy, and money to developing these as a service. So it's getting easier to consume them. You're not expected to build the end-to-end stack yourself, but that's a double-edged sword again, because you have to, as a CTO, make that decision of how fast do I need to go right now? Because if it comes down to that time piece, if you do have the time to go and build it, you've got the resources, you've got the skills, the architecture, then there are benefits that even right down to a hardware level, you could get a 1% gain. You can get a 1% gain at the software stack that you use, and that adds up. But as a startup CTO, on the flip side, you're like, I've got 12 months run rate. I need to get this service in front of my customer and making revenue in the next 3 to 6 months. I do not have time to go through hardware specifications, what GPUs we're going to use, all this sort of stuff. They might not even be available, right? It's much easier for me to go to, let's say, someone neutral like Hugging Face and go rent a load of GPUs from them and get my model trained, and I can be iterating and testing on that right now, then standing up a software stack and thinking, how am I going to do this? Am I going to terraform it or whatever sort of thing? So those decisions come into play. But then the startup CTO, hopefully company becomes successful and you get to revisit that again. Are we doing things right? So I think there's just two parallels there, that eventually that same CTO, if they stay the course, I don't know what the average tenure is on a CTO these days, probably 3 years in the enterprise, I think, is what I've seen. Then, those projects, they do stay around to go, right, now it's mature. And this has become productionized, then basically at that stage, that's where I think they'll come to revisit it, because that's where you want the marginal gains again.
And so from an enterprise point of view, is that kind of part of your decision that, you would look at almost and if we think about the established one rather than the startup, because I think the startup world is a whole different kind of ball game, and is probably more likely to be, I need to make this stuff happen quickly.
Yeah.
But from a business point of view, established business looking to invest in, so they've got the good story, they know what they're trying to do, is part of that, or is a big part of that maybe, the driver between building your own stack versus taking an existing stack is actually how quick do you need this to move?
Yeah, I think that there is that element. I've seen, even with the enterprise, so the innovation teams are typically the ones that are really pushing this forward. So they're almost like a startup within, a well-funded organization themselves. But it still has to be adopted to, like you say, the best practices that we built up over many years around security, data governance, law and legal. How expensive that can be when you go wrong there. We've seen the horror stories of American Airlines and different airline providers and things where they went too fast and perhaps didn't have the guardrails in place. So I think these decisions are just standard, good practice decisions. I think that the enterprises have a balancing act as well. So say taking a full stack off AWS or Microsoft, Bedrock, for example, with AWS. Again, their play is your data is safe with us. We give you the tools to make sure that you can clean it, you can label it, it's in the pipeline, it never leaves that data center. We invest billions a year in security and stuff. And I've heard real cloud advocates, me being one of those in the past, that would always say, I bet you that cloud data center is more secure than anything you could build yourself, because they're poking it every day more times than you could possibly try and do that, right? Not to say that we all, day zero, it's everyone, right? We're all in the same boat when that happens. But the reality here is you have to make a choice. There's pros and cons on both sides of things. I think where Microsoft have got a great play is, how many people do you know that are using Office 365? Yeah. And perhaps not the technology one it's the licensing. Everything has that look and feel that it's just under that one EA, even though, when you get to the SKUs, it's not, Copilot's £30 extra per person and things like that. But the reality is it's easy for a business to consume because it's Microsoft. It's one single vendor. They've gone through that 3-month, 6-month certification process. They've seen the DECs. They've seen all these things. And it's much easier for them to go, okay, we're going to take that service there. And they might be 6 months behind the curve, but guess what? We're an insurer. And we don't care if we're 12 months behind the curve because we are not an early adopter. So we're going to go there rather than this startup that's just rocked up and said, hey.
Just to build on kind of what you're talking about there as well, I suppose from a CTO point of view, you talked about this a couple of times, but you've got lots of decisions to make, haven't you? So before you adopt any technology, but obviously specific around AI today, before you adopt any technology, there's a bunch of things that you should be considering as a CTO. So from an AI point of view, what would be the tips that you would give somebody, as somebody who now works for a company where you're having these conversations with CTOs, but you've done this as a CTO as well. What would be the kind of tips of things that a CTO should be looking at to consider the right approach and the right technology stack to get them there?
I think really you need to look at the main reasons for most business decisions are, well, where can you increase productivity? Where can you increase customer experience the most? They're probably the two key areas that people are being most successful in today. And they're the ones that you can easily measure, demonstrate to the business, go and get further funding, and then go do a few more experiments along the way. So it comes back to that beginning, which is, do you have good enough data around your business and your processes? So let's take, for example, customer support. Let's say you have a product and you can look at everything that's ever gone wrong with it. From a product management perspective, fantastic. They can go, do you know what? We're not very good at this particular piece of our product. We're going to double down on that. We see a lot of failure rate around that. From a customer experience piece, you say, we've seen a lot of this. We can capture it. We can identify that trend. We're seeing that this month, we're seeing all this information in natural language, and that can be shared in the business much faster than before. You don't need somebody who, if you look at something like some of the more complicated CRM systems, won't name any names, where you have people that just are in there to try and dig the data out. Think of, you now have this ability to just ask the questions, I think that's the starting point. What we'll see over the future is the limitation of that is that's human to model interaction, right? We got to know what questions to ask. The problem is, think about the other way around where the model's doing the digging and it can tell you these are the questions and insights that you should be asking about your data. You've not even thought about this. That's where you start to get the value, because right now we're just looking at, I filled you full of data. I'm going to ask you the 20 smartest questions that I know right now, but we don't know what we don't know. These systems start to really add value when they start to tell you things that you've not even been able to identify yourself. And I think that's where we're moving towards. There's been a lot of study in this area. I can't remember which paper it was, but there's a lot of study in terms of delivering the insights out the other way, because everybody's familiar with asking questions one way and getting them out the model. And as we also said as well, is a large model is great and can pull out your information out, but then making this a smaller model, the SLMs, so small language models that are more specialists, can act more like a gatekeeper, make sure that, generative AI is fantastic. You're creating something new. And that's great if we say, hey, look, I want to go and create a picture of a unicorn for my kid. Fantastic if it hallucinates. That's awesome. I get an even better looking unicorn. But the problem is if it hallucinates in 40 out of 100 of my customer experiences, that's a really bad problem. Yeah. Especially if you're more established brands, you're open to somebody abusing it in some way. We've heard of first-class air flight upgrades that they had to honor and all the rest sort of thing. And
is it in that kind of instance, is it those kind of small models and those specific models trained on your data that start to minimize that kind of risk? Yeah. That those risks come the more, if you're going to go and ask ChatGPT, just generally ChatGPT on, go find it and go to their website, it's more chance for it hallucinating than if you've trained. Yeah, it's fair. Actually, let's pick on Copilot for 365. Yeah. If you're using Copilot for 365, it should be learning based on the information that exists in your 365 tenancy, depending on what you're doing. Yeah. Versus just go online and say, "Hey, ChatGPT, tell me this kind of thing." Is that accurate to say that's going to be a better, more accurate model for the business answers, or am I just assuming it is? No,
it's more accurate to say that because you've got a more up to date, more specific sort of data set that it's learning from and pulling from. On the flip side of that, the challenges you have around that is you can't just expose all your data to a model that perhaps, even some of the vendors there could be considered that other elements of the business are actually competitive to yours. Do you want to put it in this model? Are they training on it behind the scenes? They say they're not. These are things that other CTOs are really thinking about. So I think that's where, what happens once it passes our perimeter and goes to someone else's. I'm not saying be scared of using them, but these are on your mind, genuine questions where you're like, well, I can't answer past a certain point. The other thing here, though, that is a foundational problem for many of these businesses right now is permissions. So Office 365, great. ACLs, ACLs, as we call them, right? The access control lists that say you have access to the roadmap for the next 2 years. You own that. And perhaps somebody on the analyst team should not see that, because that's pretty dangerous knowledge in the wrong hands, or somebody just in your customer experience team should not be able to see that, because they shouldn't be promising, hey, listen, we've got feature X coming out in 3 months and it will fix all your problems.
Yeah, what you don't want is salespeople having access to promises. Definitely don't want that.
Yeah, and we've all been there, right? So the same practices come in is, okay, good data governance. We're making sure that people have access to what they should have. Now, how do we go and put that in an all-seeing, all-knowing model that doesn't necessarily understand ACLs? It doesn't understand the data that we don't have in Office 365, which is unstructured and sat in a database. For example, really exciting use case. So everyone knows the retrieval augmented generation one, the RAG one, where you put unstructured data in, you feed it, you turn it into embeddings, put it in a vector database, and then it all gets pulled out and decoded, right? So that's the transformer architecture. The other side of things is, what about Q&A? So Q&A is the second model that's evolving right now, which is the ability where this system can write SQL queries. So your DBA, in the old days, got a user specification for select all from this table, blah, 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 blah. This is how we want to look at our data. And that was pretty much how you used your database. Now you have the ability, for better or for worse, to say, I now have a generative DBA. I want to ask this about this with this bit and this bit and this bit, and I don't need to wait for somebody to code it. It goes and creates a SQL query for you, right? And there's open source versions and there's more advanced versions available as well. What's the problem with that? Well, hang on, databases don't have permissions on them in the same way that perhaps my documents did. Or did you really go as far as I'm going to permission every single row for every single user? Maybe you did. I don't know. I don't know many that have gone that far. Myself included. I know like DynamoDB where, you could do per row permissions and things. But the reality is now you've got a whole new set of problems because it's not just because you can, maybe you need to take a step back, and doesn't mean you should, because what happens when that data goes somewhere it shouldn't? And somebody is able to say, hey, listen, how are we financially performing? I'm going to go leak that to someone, or that's insider trading, or whatever it is. These things still need to be considered. And the worst case is, right, just like in real life humans, sometimes they get it wrong. What happens if it drops your table?
Well, just as maybe as a final question, because we're kind of coming to the end of our time here. So just as a final question, because I think that's really interesting, that idea of what if it's wrong, and so there's the what if it breaks it, but there's also, well, what if the response is wrong? Any tips for how people manage that process? What kind of checks do, maybe particularly in the early days, is there any recommendation about the kind of checks people should be putting in place to say, well, look, I'm going to trust this new model, but how do you build it so that that you can trust it ultimately? You talked a couple of times about, if 3 in 100 of my things are wrong, am I going to trust that model? So is there any kind of process people should be putting in place around that, and any tips on how they do it?
Treat it like a corporate credit card, I would say. Yeah. Treat it like a corporate credit card. And the reason I say that is you have your staff, you train them, but you don't just let them loose. You have a set of processes that says, what did they spend this month? Is that right? Is that wrong? How much did they spend? I'm going to go and question that. Treat it the exact same way. Put the observability in there. Is this right? Is this wrong? Just keep reviewing it. It's not a one and done process. You have to come and review that purposefully. And then that 3 might become 2 and that 2 might become 1. But even if you got to 0, let's just say you had the perfect system. How do you know it's perfect if you're not monitoring it?
Yeah.
You have to have those processes in all the way from, the way we did with virtualization. What was it, 2009, 2008? And, certain vendors came out and changed the world because you could finally see, this is the disk it's on. There's the IOPS it's running. There's the hotspot. I'm running out of cores. I've run out of RAM. Yeah, it's the same process here. You've got to go, okay, where's the data in? How am I monitoring that that's correct? How am I feeding new up-to-date information in there? How am I monitoring that that's not got credit card information in it, or someone's, as our US counterparts, social security, or what do we call it? National insurance. So you still have to have all of this governance and these processes and framework in place, extended across your new framework. You cannot forget them, and they have to continue onwards.
So, okay, as we kind of wrap up here, is there anywhere that, you've got lots of insights in this space. Is there anywhere that you're publishing some of this stuff? Can people find out more about what you're doing, follow you on LinkedIn, whatever it might be?
Yeah, I'm available on LinkedIn. I publish there. I can't remember what my URL is. Just type Kirk Ryan. I do have a blog as well, kirkryan.co.uk. So I've got a few things on there. I've got an upcoming blog around multi-agent performance versus cost. I see a lot of things that are very scientific, but I wanted to actually get it back to how much is this actually going to cost you? But yeah, that's where I'll regularly be sharing thoughts and theories and general experiments.
Yeah, well, I think this is because it's interesting what you're talking about there. About you probably never get to a point where you don't ever want to be checking this model, because part of this thing is the whole point of them is that they evolve and learn. That's almost the point of these things existing. And actually, if you're not keeping an eye on what it is that it's learning, but that's great. We'll make sure that goes in the show notes so people can find your thoughts.
Perfect.
And your thoughts and things around AI.
Ramblings.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to say that, but ramblings. That's what my blog's for. So, look, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on the show, and look forward to seeing you again soon. And and look forward to checking out your ramblings around AI as we go. But for now, Kate, thanks very much. Appreciate your time.
Thanks very much.
If you enjoyed this episode of CTO Insights, then to make sure you catch all future episodes, then do subscribe. You can subscribe here on YouTube by clicking the subscribe button, and you can find us in all good homes of podcasts. But until next time, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you again on another CTO Insights soon.